Herman glided rapidly across the room and stood before him, and Herman recognized the Countess. "I have come to you against my wish," she said in a firm voice, "but I have been ordered to grant your request. 3-7 ace will win for you if played in succession, but only on these conditions: that you do not play more than one card in 24 hours, and that you never play again during the rest of your life. I forgive you my death on condition that you marry my companion, Lizaveta Ivanovna." With these words she turned around very quietly, walked with a shuffling gait towards the door, and disappeared. Herman heard the street door open and shut, and again he saw someone looking at him through the window. For a long time Herman could not recover himself. He then rose up and entered the room. His orderly was lying asleep upon the floor, and he had much difficulty in waking him. The orderly was drunk as usual, and no information could be obtained from him. The street door was locked. Herman returned to his room, lit his candle, and wrote down all the details of his vision. 6. Two fixed ideas can no more exist together in the moral world than two bodies can occupy one and the same place in the physical world. 3-7 ace soon drove out of Herman's mind the thought of the dead Countess. 3-7 ace were perpetually running through his head and continually being repeated by his lips. If he saw a young girl, he would say, "How slender she is, quite like the 3 of hearts." If anybody asked, "What is the time?" he would reply, 5 minutes to 7. Every stout man that he saw reminded him of the ace. 3-7 ace haunted him in his sleep, and assumed all possible shapes. The 3s bloomed before in the forms of magnificent flowers, the 7s were represented by Gothic portals, and the aces became transformed into gigantic spiders. One thought alone occupied his whole mind: to make a profitable use of the secret which he had purchased so dearly. He thought of applying for a furlough so as to travel abroad. He wanted to go to Paris and tempt fortune in some of the public gambling houses that abounded there. Chance spared him all this trouble. There was in Moscow a society of rich gamesters, presided over by the celebrated Chekalinsky, who had passed all his life at the card table and had amassed millions, accepting bills of exchange for his winnings and paying his losses in ready money. His long experience secured for him the confidence of his companions, and his open house, his famous cook, and his agreeable and fascinating manners gained for him the respect of the public. He came to St. Petersburg. The young men of the capital flocked to his rooms, forgetting balls for cards, and preferring the emotions of faro to the seductions of flirting. Narumov conducted Herman to Chekalinsky's residence. They passed through a suite of magnificent rooms, filled with attentive domestics. The place was crowded. Generals and privy councillors were playing at whist. Young men were lolling carelessly upon the velvet-covered sofas, eating ices and smoking pipes. In the drawing-room, at the head of a long table, around which were assembled about a score of players, sat the master of the house, keeping his bank. He was a man of about 60 years of age, of a very dignified appearance. His head was covered with silvery white hair, his full florid countenance expressed a good nature, and his eyes twinkled with a perpetual smile. Narumov introduced Herman to him. Chekalinsky shook him by the hand in a friendly manner, requesting him not to stand on ceremony, and then went on dealing. The game occupied some time. On the table lay more than 30 cards. Chekalinsky paused after each throw, in order to give the players time to arrange their cards and note down their losses, listened politely to their requests, and more politely still, put straight the corners of cards that some players' hands had chanced to bend. At last the game was finished. Chekalinsky shuffled the cards and prepared to deal again. "Will you allow me to take a card?" said Herman, stretching out his hand from behind a stout gentleman who was punting. Chekalinsky smiled and bowed silently, as a sign of acquiescence. Narumov laughingly congratulated Herman on his abjuration of that abstention from cards which he had practised for so long a period, and wished him a lucky beginning. "Stake," said Herman, writing some figures with the chalk on the back of his card. "How much?" asked the baker, contracting the muscles of his eyes. "Excuse me, I cannot see quite clearly." 47,000 roubles, replied Herman. At these words every head in the room turned suddenly around, and all eyes were fixed on Herman. "He's taken leave of his senses," thought Narumov. "Allow me to inform you," said Chekalinsky, with his eternal smile, "that you are playing very high. Nobody here has ever staked more than 275 roubles at once." "Very well," replied Herman, "but do you accept my card or not?" Chekalinsky bowed in token of consent. "I only wish to observe," said he, "that although I have the greatest confidence in my friends, I can only play against ready money. For my own part, I am quite convinced that your word is sufficient, but for the sake of the order of the game, and to facilitate the reckoning up, I must ask you to put the money on your card." Herman drew from his pocket a banknote and handed it to Chekalinsky, who, after examining it in a cursory manner, placed it on Herman's card. He began to deal. On the right a 9 turned up, and on the left a 3. "I have won," said Herman, showing his card. A murmur of astonishment rose among the players. Chekalinsky frowned, but the smile quickly returned to his face. "Do you wish me to settle with you?" he said to Hermann. "If you please," replied the latter. Chekalinsky drew from his pocket a number of banknotes and paid at once. Hermann took up his money and left the table. Narumov could not recover from his astonishment. Hermann drank a glass of lemonade and returned home. The next evening he again repaired to Chekalinsky's. The host was dealing. Hermann walked up to the table. The punters immediately made room for him. Chekalinsky greeted him with a gracious bow. Hermann waited for the next deal, took a card and placed upon it his 47,000 roubles, together with his winnings of the previous evening. Chekalinsky began to deal. A knave turned up on the right, a 7 on the left. Hermann showed his 7. There was a general exclamation. Chekalinsky was evidently ill at ease, but he counted out the 94,000 roubles and handed them over to Hermann, pocketed them in the coolest manner possible, and immediately left the house. The next evening Hermann appeared again at the table. Every one was expecting him. The generals and the privy councillors left their whist in order to watch such extraordinary play. The young officers quitted their sofas, and even the servants crowded into the room. All pressed around Hermann. The other players left off punting, impatient to see how it would end. Hermann stood at the table and prepared to play alone against the pale, but still smiling, Chekalinsky. Each opened a pack of cards. Chekalinsky shuffled. Hermann took a card and covered it with a pile of banknotes. It was like a duel. Deep silence reigned around. Chekalinsky began to deal. His hands trembled. On the right a queen turned up, and on the left an ace. "Ace has won," cried Hermann, showing his card. "Your queen has lost," said Chekalinsky politely. Hermann started. Instead of an ace, there lay before him the queen of spades. He could not believe his eyes, nor could he understand how he had made such a mistake. At that moment it seemed to him that the queen of spades smiled ironically and winked her eye at him. He was struck by her remarkable resemblance. "The old Countess!" he exclaimed, seized with terror. Chekalinsky gathered up his winnings. For some time Hermann remained perfectly motionless. When at last he left the table, there was a general commotion in the room. "Splendidly punted," said the players. Chekalinsky shuffled the cards afresh, and the game went on as usual. Hermann went out of his mind, and is now confined in room number 17 of the Opakov hospital. He never answers any questions, but he constantly mutters with usual rapidity, 3-7 ace, 3-7 queen. Lizaveta Ivanovna has married a very amiable young man, a son of the former steward of the old Countess. He is in the service of the state somewhere, and is in receipt of a good income. Lizaveta is also supporting a poor relative. Tomsky has been promoted to the rank of captain, and has become the husband of the Princess Pauline.
End of The Queen of Spades by Alexander Pushkin, Part 2.